My dear Kant, you posit a stark division between phenomena and noumena, claiming we can only know things as they appear to us, mediated by the structures of our mind. This is a grave error, for you sever the intellect from reality itself. In my view, the human intellect, though finite, is capable of grasping the quiddity, the essential nature of things as they are in themselves, through the active cooperation of our cognitive faculties. The univocity of being ensures that our concepts of existence apply equally to God and creatures, allowing us to apprehend the real without being confined to mere appearances. Your phenomenal veil, while perhaps safeguarding humility, risks imprisoning the mind in a web of its own making, denying the soul's capacity to transcend and touch the individual essence of things as they truly exist in God's order. You claim that categories like causality and substance are imposed by the mind, but this underestimates the harmony between the created order and our intellect, which is divinely ordained to know truth. I grant that our knowledge is imperfect, clouded by sin and the limits of our embodiment. Yet through abstraction and the light of divine ideas, we can attain genuine insight into the essay of things, not merely their shadows in our perception. Your system, Kant, reduces knowledge to a construct of subjective conditions, but I urge you to reconsider. The world is not so opaque, nor our minds so divorced from it, that we cannot know things as they are, in their proper being by the grace of the Creator, who made both mind and reality to correspond.
Hello. Oh man, are we going to have a good show today? How is that for an exclusive interview? Look, I figured all the other big channels are doing these exclusive interviews. I needed my own. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. The great subtle doctor lecturing the continental doctor of the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, on the knowability of the essay of things. It doesn't get any more real than that, folks. It was a real interview, by the way. So, I see the comments are working. Caught me off guard. Good. I wanted to make sure. That's an old professor's trick. Make sure everybody's paying attention so you catch them off guard. I had some issues with the comments last time, but I apologize about that. I can see that today they are working. I finished up the lecture last time and I said, gosh, this must have been the most boring lecture ever. I didn't have a single comment. And then I went and I checked on YouTube and it was like flooded with like 4 or 5 different questions. I wasn't ignoring your questions. StreamYard, just for whatever reason, glitched and I didn't get to see them. So I apologize about that. So, hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City the Immaculata back with you. We have today the penultimate lecture, I think. No, how many more do I have of these? I'm doing a few more of these Franciscan lectures. I said I was getting back to my roots a little bit. This one's going to be a little bit dense. I'm not going to lie. It took me a little while to kind of wrap my mind around how I wanted to do this one. I'm borrowing from some friends of mine to be able to make this one happen for you guys tonight. First, though, subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot. YouTube, subscribe there. Click the like button. All of that stuff helps me out a lot. Also, can't forget to do some self-promotion over at Patreon. We are still going through our errors of the Eastern Orthodox, and we have about 3 more videos of that. This week, we just put out Peter the Aleut, whether he was a martyr or a myth. You have to go over there to find out for yourselves what the answer of that may be. Also, over there at Patreon tomorrow, and this will be free for everybody. You don't even need to make sure I got this like scheduled correctly, set up correctly. I'm going to be doing a book club, and I didn't even grab the book. I'm going to be doing a book club on Rebuild My Church by Father Andronco on the ecclesiology and Mariology of Father Peter Fellner, which is going to be a fantastic introduction for you guys into Franciscan theology, as it was for me. And so I figured I get asked a lot, like, where do I begin when I want to study Franciscan theology? Where's the place to go to? And I struggle answering with that because I didn't come into it and dare I say, I didn't come into it in an orthodox way. I just kind of stumbled backwards into it and have been sort of like worked my way around until I sort of found my niche within it. So I've kind of struggled with like helping you guys like where to begin. I think this is going to be a good place to begin because with Father Fellner, you're going to get St. Francis, you're going to get the Seraphic Doctor, you're going to get the Subtle Doctor, you're going to get the lineage that of the corpus the massive corpus that he absorbed throughout the Baroque period and the early modern period, and as well the actual modern period that I think he took on quite well. And today is actually going to be inspired by Father Fellner. We got a little bit of everything today. I had fun putting this one together. I had some extra time on my hands as we move into the fall. You know, we've kind of moving into homeschooling and these types of things. And while I'm waiting for my son to do his work, I'm just working on a few things myself. So I put together a little slideshow for you guys for this one to kind of help you get started. Some of that slide stuff is going to be review, but I don't want to assume too much on the part of the audience. Before that, though, as I said, the inspiration for this has to be noted because, again, it's coming from Father Peter Fellner. Now, if you're going to read Father Fellner, that's the next question I get asked. It's like, okay, well, where do I read Father Fellner? There's easier works by him and there's more difficult works by him. Probably that I have encountered yet, and I've encountered quite a bit of his work. The most difficult is this volume right here, volume 8, Studies Systematic and Critical. And I would caution you for that one unless you're well versed in modern philosophy, because he's engaging a lot of the modern. This is the volume where he sort of engages the modern world and critiques it the most. It's probably the most rewarding of all of Father Fellner's work for me personally, but it's also probably the most difficult to access. And I had to go back and sort of review some things. I'm actually helping with the behind the scenes project, transcribing some of his lectures from 20, 30 years ago. And that's actually helped me quite a bit because I'm getting sort of this firsthand lectures when you're sitting at the feet of the master, so to speak. In this volume 8, there are 2 things. One, he writes this really beautiful essay called Scotus and Newman in Dialogue. And clearly I am borrowing from the title for this live from that essay. The major difference being, Scotus and Newman have a real overlap in their thinking, that which Fellner kind of lays out like masterfully in a very, very long essay in this work. unlike what we're going to be covering today, which is Scotus and Immanuel Kant, who are much more difficult, if not impossible, to overlap. And then there's another in here, which I found very helpful, on Transcendental Thomism, which was a movement to situate the insights of Immanuel Kant into a Thomist framework. This was carried out by men like Marseille, Lonergan, and maybe most prolifically by Rahner. Now, in our dialogue today, we're not going to try to synthesize Scotus and Immanuel Kant. That's above my pay grade. In most ways, I don't think it can even be done. Not while retaining the essential thesis of both men. You either have one or the other, and it's going to have to, you're going to have to capitulate on some key aspects of their thought in order for there to be unity. Though others have, apparently there, and I'm not familiar with who these people would be, but apparently there were so-called Scotists who attempted, like the Transcendental Thomists did, to systematize or synthesize Scotus and Immanuel Kant in together. We'll maybe get to some of the reasons why we can't. We will get to some of the reasons why we can't do that here in a little bit, but I do want to say that there were numerous ways, since I was kind of building a lecture like this from the ground up, there's numerous ways I could have taken it. Since these two men are much has been said of them, who themselves left a very substantial body of work to digest. We're going to just limit ourselves here to what I think is the issue that really keeps them from even getting off the ground constructively. I would say everything else flows downstream. The reasons why there's such a divergence between these two thinkers is going to begin with what I believe is this primary reason why, even if there was a seeming comparative analysis that could be made further downstream, if you're aware of this divergence at the beginning, by the time you get downstream, it's they're pretty far apart, even if the language may be somewhat similar. The other thing I want to add is that while we will be largely critiquing Kant here, this is not to say that I find nothing redeeming at all in Immanuel Kant. In fact, in some ways, it's quite the opposite. I actually respect Immanuel Kant, and that's why I wanted to do this particular lecture. From the time that I became Catholic, I even think for some reason he came up in my RCIA program. But for whatever reason, whenever you touch upon philosophy as a Catholic, one of the things that you're going to hear, and it's usually done in a sentence or two, is that Immanuel Kant is sort of the catalyst for all of the problems with the way that modern people think. And there's no doubt whatsoever that he was a massively influential thinker. But I've always felt as a Catholic that the response to Immanuel Kant's critiques weren't as adequate or as thorough or as robust as I would prefer them to be. I feel like it's very much a dismissal rather than a full-on engagement. Because Kant, in many ways, I think he has the right inclinations. He says, hey, I came across Hume, I came across David Hume, and David's thinking, his writings, particularly his essays on human knowledge, aroused. Kant said they woke him from the slumber that he had been in, this intellectual slumber that he had been in, and he set to work to really try to be a response to David Hume's challenges, which were in many ways much more problematic for Christians. Kant, he intuited enough to know that this is a real problem that we have. And look, I grant I am the first person to admit, I should say I humbly admit, and this is a moment of confession and humility for me to admit this, that I think that some of the skeptical arguments I liken it to like standing on the precipice of an abyss. And it's this like, it's an abyss. It's this dark abyss that you look out into. And, you know, if one really wanted to venture close to the edge of that abyss, there's like this potential of this like shadowy hand that comes up from the darkness and pulls you down into it, because there's just something about philosophical skepticism that is incredibly tantalizing to the human mind. And it's almost like a cheap way out of all of this, right? Out of these sort of problems that arose in the wake of Descartes and then the British empiricists. Nietzsche said, right? Nietzsche said, "He who stares in too long into the abyss begins to stare back at you." Well, I have felt that, right? And that's why, you know, had a soft spot in my heart for what Immanuel Kant was trying to do, which was to say, hey, look, I see this as a problem, but I want to come up with an answer for it. Now, the criticism, and I think it's a fair criticism of Immanuel Kant, is that in his efforts to come up with an answer for it, he kind of makes the problem worse. So that's what we're going to cover a little bit today too. Now, I don't want to get too like bogged down into the various different things. I mean, you do have to at least be aware of David Hume to sort of step into the world of Immanuel Kant. You have to kind of like you acknowledge the potency of Hume's arguments, the sort of at least the undeniable effect that these skeptical arguments had on modernity, right? We live in a post-Lockean, post-Humean world, no doubt about it whatsoever. Speaking of doubt, though, let's take a minute here. I want to review these slides. I came up with some slides for you guys because I want to make sure that I'm not assuming too much on the part of you guys, what you know about these things and what you don't. And so what some of the core differences are going to be in terms of what we're interested in. And then we're going to once I come back, once we like get on the other side of these slides, we're going to talk about what I think is that launching point that separates Scotus and Kant from even really having a significant, I mean, they would undoubtedly have an amazing conversation together, and I would love to just be like a fly on the wall of that conversation. But if I could get, if I could get, I heard, I think his name was a philosophy professor, and he said if he could get Immanuel Kant into a room to debate with David Hume, he would love to have seen that conversation, but he would then turn to Aristotle and find out what the answers to the things that they were debating were about. And I think there's it was being coy, but I think that's actually, there's some truth tied up in all of that. And I kind of feel that way. Like sometimes when you hear the moderns talk, like I listen to them and knowing what I know of Blessed John Duns Scotus, who himself in many ways was accepting of a lot of the Aristotelian premises, though he sort of has his own unique insights as well. I would love to just see what his response to some of these things would be. But alas, we don't have that. So we have to kind of pretend, as it were, to see what some of these may be. Now, I'm going to have to switch to get these slides going. Yep. All right. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. So we're going to start with idealism. Whoops. We're going to start with idealism. And what's happening with idealism loosely, is that actually where I started? Let me make sure that's where I started. Yep, that's where I started. Okay. Idealism is simply saying that there's the world out there. And again, I know this is going to be like so elementary 101 for some of you guys, but if it is, just deal with it because I want to make sure everybody's up to speed. The world out there has data, and the data comes to our senses. But the question is, how does the data come to our senses, and how does the the way that the mind processes that data, how does it map on to what's out there in the world? So I'm using like a black box. It's just an object, right? It's an object out there in the world. Well, the idealists, and there's many different idealists, and this is a very rough, crude way of expressing what they would say, is the idealists would say, well, you don't actually get to the world out there. Some of these are going to be a little bit more moderate in their tone about this. Some of these, like Berkeley, are going to be a little bit more extreme in it and say that there isn't even a world out there to get to. But roughly saying, what they're saying is like, look, this black box that you run across, this object, it emanates maybe, but it emanates into this idea which is what you actually have access to. So you can't like get past the idea. The idea is what is like formed and comes to the mind, and the mind is only the idea is the only thing that's accessible to the mind. The object out there in the world, you don't have any access to that. And the real like kicker for all of this, of course, is going to be David Hume, who comes along and he throws causality out the window. He throws in he even goes after some of the presuppositions of Lockean idealism and says that, you know, even the whole concept of self to Hume is just a series of representations. So Hume is like the big upset for the entire philosophical idealist world. Now Kant wants to come along and say, okay, there's a box out there, and I want to, in my mind, I want to access that box. Well, in order for me to access that box, I have this barrier, okay? And this barrier is going to be, he begins with what are called a priori. These categories of things that like we have to have in order to access the box at all. So these are going to be a sense of spatial dimensions. These are going to be a sense of temporal dimensions. All of these things are going to affect the way that what eventually comes back to us as an idea. So Kant is an idealist in a sense. He's not a realist, but the key to Kant's thinking here is that it's actually, unlike the former idealists and unlike the entire medieval tradition, which believed that the senses were passive and they received information from the data that was out there in the world, Kant had what he called his Copernican revolution, where he flips these things on its head and says, no, it's actually us that force our senses onto the material world out there. And so I use this barrier here is just to represent that, like, there's something between us and the object, right? That's what Kant says. And that thing is a filter. You can't get through that filter. So it's probably hard to tell, but the first arrow that I send out here is just like a black arrow, right? And that's just like the totally unbiased, I'm trying to get out to the world, but then the senses hit this filter. And that filter is going to affect the way that everything else, the way that I come into contact with the object. So now if you see the arrows blue on the other side of that filter, and the way that that object, the information from that object, the data comes back to me, it's all got to come through that filter. So even when I'm getting it, I'm not actually getting the object as it is. And so what he's saying here is, I may have a representation in my mind of a blue box, because I'm using this in a very crude way, but let's just say the filter is a hue of blue, right? Like you can't see past this blue filter that literally colors the way that you see the entire world, right? You can't like just kind of like drop that veil and see around it. It's going to affect everything. So you may think that that's a blue box that you're looking at, but you can't tell because of the way that these limitations of our sense perception act on us and act on the world. Now, he's going to famously call the object, the box in itself, the noumena, and he's going to call the thing that comes back to us, this representation, a phenomena. And the phenomena is, and I've heard, I'm not a Kantian scholar by far, but I've heard some people that are more interested and more well-read in Kant than I am, that Kant there's some argument about whether or not Kant believes that we have any access to the noumena, but certainly there's a severe limitation on what we know about the objects in the world. Like, the reality is, like, this book looks blue to me, but I don't know this, and I can the density, the weight, the shape of it, the time it takes for me to, like, the measurement it takes for me to be able to lift it up, and these types of things, these are all based on sensory data that I'm putting onto the object, and that's going to affect the way that I see and experience this object. And so all of that stuff, the way that I see it, the way that it looks to me, the colors that all of these things are the phenomenal aspects of the object. I can't get to this. I can't, like, step around that hurdle and get to what this thing is in and of itself. So that's basically his solution to this problem in a nutshell. Now, what do the realists say? What do the real ones say? Well, realism says, okay, there is an object in the world, and this object emanates sense data. This is going to be like an Aristotelian take on these, a realist take. And the sense data puts what Aristotle would call a phantasm is formed in the mind, and the phantasm is presented to the mind, and then the mind is able to begin to, through the process of abstraction, apprehend what the object is in the world. So it's a realism because a realist would believe that, granting some of the troubles that we have, I mean, Aristotle was he was not against, like, empirical induction and these types of things. Like, he knew that there were I could have a faulty sense of smell, I could have a faulty sense of sight. Any of these things could affect the way that I'm receiving the information of that box. But, like, multiple experiences of this book by multiple people multiple times, and then we generally get a sense of what this book really is. It's blue, it's heavy, it's got these dimensions to it. And so the phantasm then is, barring the particular circumstances of where it might be problematic, the phantasm is a real representation of what the object is out there in the world. Now, there's going to be varying degrees of realism too. There's, like, moderate realism, which really most of your scholastic thinkers are going to be. They're more moderate realists, but they all believe, like Aristotle, that you have a general ability to perceive the world as it is. And this is a very important thing. And a lot is going to ride on whether or not we are actually able to perceive the world as it is, because this is the foundation for much of our metaphysics. All right. And then another aspect to this realism, another crucial element to all of this is, like, let's say I run into one box. Okay. I've experienced that box. And then I run into another and another and another. And so after a while, I get a fifth box that I run into, and I'm able at a certain point to intuit immediately. And this is going to be one of Scotus's really important contributions to the conversation. There's this intuitive grasping of the universal boxness of the box that I'm running into and how it relates to all the other boxes that I've seen in the past. I'm using the box as an example, but you could be like a dog, right? I've seen this dog, I've seen this dog, I've seen this dog. I start to, through the process of this, become more concretely aware of not just this particular dog or this particular dog or this particular dog, but dogness, the universal ideal of dog. So that when I come across the fifth dog or the sixth dog, I begin to intuit immediately without even going through this whole long process of abstraction, cognitive abstraction that you do when you run across the first dog that you've ever encountered, or even the second dog, and these types of things. So that's another important thing, like whether or not the mind is able to not just grab a particular book and grasp it, like mentally grasp it, but whether or not we can grasp and apprehend the universal. Boxness, right? Boxness, and then this particular box. We kind of have an idea of both. All right. Now, and this is not going to be all slides in this lecture, guys, but I just want to like get to, I wanted to introduce you to this because this is, I think, going to be the key insight, which is going to separate Scotus from the moderns. And Scotus, in many ways, people say this, I think it's probably true. And Scotus is, in many ways, is the like last of the really great scholastic realists. Because after Scotus, then we're going to get William of Ockham, then we're going to get Descartes, then we're going to get Hobbes and Bacon, and the trajectory is just going to change from there. It's going to be like a cascading thing. But Scotus is in this line of realist thinkers who think that we have access to not just that we have access to the object itself, but that the object itself is part of this category of a thing which we can kind of come to know. And this thing that we can come to know is going to be the starting point, actually, of all of our metaphysics moving forward. And that is going to be being. So I've got a whole video on Scotus's univocal concept of being. I'm not going to like sort of hash it all out here, but the important things to realize with all of this is that Scotus, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but just kind of give you a visual. Scotus says that being is by definition, it's the ens qui non repugnant esse. It's that for which to be is not repugnant, which is a very broad definition of being, right? Being for Scotus is, in this sense, it's a very wide category that is not a genus, which he's often accused of being, of saying rather. And then the other thing is you've got this univocal concept, which means that when we speak about being, we're speaking about it in a way which there's something about the way that this is one of the more controversial things between Scotists and Thomists. There's something, says Scotus, between the way that we speak about being as a human being, and then something about that is directly correlated to the way that we speak about being as God, as being. And the big difference, though, is that when you're speaking about man as being, you're speaking about something that's finite, which there's a disjunct there between man and God, which you're speaking about an infinite being. So it's not even like you can't, unlike some of the claims, Scotus doesn't believe that you can drop God down into the category like, there's God, man, plant, rock, that kind of thing. That's not what he's getting at, but that's getting too far afield. The whole thing there, though, is that within this little frame, you've got being. And being is that for which to be is not repugnant. Everything else outside of that frame, everything else outside of that box is non-being. It's the opposite of that. It's for which being is repugnant. So that's Scotus's definition. And we're going to, like I said, we're going to kind of work into that a little bit more here in a minute. With Kant, though, it's much, much different. For Kant, he sees being not as a real predicate, not even really as a useful term, other than for a more like utilitarian purposes, right? Like, okay, we've got Kant in this sense, following after William of Ockham, following after the nominalists, is really just going to see being as a tool. It's like a term for which you put all of these things into, and then we get on to the other things that I really want to talk about, right? He's not so concerned about being the way that Scotus is going to be. And this is really going to affect the way that we do religion, theology. It's going to affect the way that we do both revealed and natural theology. It's going to affect the way that We look at our anthropology and our cosmology and our human life, and all of these things are really going to be, if you break apart here at this moment, you're not going to be with Scotus further down the road when he's making his other conclusions. So for Kant, he's saying being is not, it's not this term. Well, he says it's a term, but it's a nominal term. It's a conceptual term that is only useful in so much as it helps me to categorize the noumena and making that distinction between noumena and phenomena. And then he says, look, as far as it goes, I don't actually have access to the being itself, right? We've got this wall, we've got this filter that we can't get past. So his question then, his primary concern is, how do I know? How do I know everything that's on this side of the bar here, right? Everything that's on his side, how does he know to get what he can of the information that's outside of that bar over to the box? I'm going to try to make more sense of this as I go along, but I wanted to give you guys some visuals to begin with. Now, again, there is some, I just threw this in there just to say that there is some that say that Kant says that we have access in whatever degree that we do to the noumena. I kind of doubt I don't think that's the major part of Kant's project. The main part of Kant's project is that, like, we are stuck with these filters that we can't get past. And everything comes through that. And so then it becomes this almost like obsession, right? And that's what we're really going to like focus on here. Whereas Scotus, and this is key, guys, this is why it's so important to like understand these things. Scotus says that being, the reason that we're focused on being is because it's predicated on something that is the verb that we use to express being. Is, am, are, right? These are saying something that there's something that's happening there, that it's like, I am this, and this would go to a scriptural sense too. Scotus does not deny the ipsum esse subsistence of God, but also that there is, when I go out into the world and I'm going to experience being, it's pointing me and it's leading me in the direction of infinite being. So Scotus is really like, this is why he's so insistent on univocal language, because he says that language must be univocal to have any kind of meaning, to get across that disjunct, because there is a disjunct between the finite and the infinite. So if there was just, if the language was just analogical, then we would never be able to really say anything about God. But since being, there's this very, very broad sense in which being is univocal across the disjunct. This allows for being meaningful language in what Scotus says is practical theology, because for Scotus, theology is practical. So, all right, that's what I have for those. All right. Let me see here now. Okay. Now I want to kind of like quickly run through the terminology, because this is another problem. One of the most confusing things you have to be careful about in philosophy always is that philosophers want to come up with unique original terms to express this neat little novel idea that they have. So instead of just like inventing language, they borrow from the guys that came before them, even though their definition is different. And then when you have like 2, 3, 4, 5 people reformulating definitions, by the time that you get to Immanuel Kant, even if he's using the terms that you would find in the scholastics, you're not using the same, it's an equivocation. And Kant, one of the things that makes everything so difficult with trying to read Kant, besides the fact that he just wasn't a really He's a fantastic thinker. He was not necessarily a great writer. And it's his philosophical lingo is kind of a nightmare. And he's notorious for like changing up terms from even just his immediate predecessors. So many of the terms he uses, he's not using in the traditional sense of the word, which will affect how you read and compare his thought. So just a few, and there's so many of these that we could be discussing, but just a few of the important ones. One, the term transcendental, right? For Aristotle, it was pretty plain. Aristotle had his categories. Everything beyond those categories were the transcendent. They were the metaphysical. And the primary one that we're concerned with, of course, especially here tonight, is being. Being for Catholics is primarily compared to the name of God given to Moses, the I am. And again, as I said, this and St. Thomas was really big on this, the ipsum esse subsistens. With Scotus in his kind of unique position on being, there's a really robust and good and interesting debate that takes place between the Thomists and the Scotists here. But like even as I have been transcribing some of these lectures from Father Fellner, I've kind of come to a greater appreciation on actually how much closer Thomas and Scotus are on this than some of the more like disputational elements may lead you to believe, because Thomas doesn't deny that there's some univocal sense in a very broad sense, and Scotus does not deny that there's not an analogical sense to being. The thing is the emphasis, right? They have two different emphases because they're worried about two different things. So with Scotus and his position on being is that it's he's not so much concerned with the I am as he is with the being able to, as I said, make our language work to be able to talk about God in a way that's meaningful so that we can therefore make our theology practical, because otherwise we're talking about things that don't actually relate to the theology that we're trying to apply to our living. Now for Kant, though, being, as I said, is just another category. It's a mental construct. It's like it's a pigeonhole that we put things into to make them useful to talk about. But there is no sense, there's no metaphysical sense of being for Kant as there would be for a realist. It's really not useful beyond its linguistic utility. Now, transcendental for the Catholic would include those things which we predicate of God. Unlike Kant, who was, as we said, with this idea of transcendental as being a leap from the phenomena to the noumena, which he says we can't make, right? So ultimately metaphysics are, and again, Kantian scholars will argue about this, but ultimately I think it makes metaphysics pretty much a moot point, or it makes it like a very like specialized niche point that a philosopher up in his ivy tower is concerned about. It's not the kind of thing that's going to go out and solve a moral issue out in the world. So again, with the Catholics, though, it's something that we can, the transcendentals are something that we can predicate of God, right? The true, the good, oneness. And Scotus, again, makes a distinction between what he calls the disjunctive transcendentals as well. This would be finite and infinite, or necessary and contingent, and so on. But for Kant, it's just a mental bridge. It's this bridge between the extra mental, the object in itself, as I can't experience it, that I can't get around, and then there's the intramental processes that we rely on to know the world, which are not metaphysics. It's just simply physics. The next thing is the difference between the ideal and the real. We're not using that same terminology when you're dealing with Immanuel Kant. So for Aristotelians, one can mostly rely on the senses. giving due recognition to the fact that there are limitations with sense perception, but what the phantasm produces, and a phantasm is, you can make it, it's comparable, it's somewhat akin to like Hume's mental representations or Locke's ideas, which we can maybe talk about here more in a minute. But it was seen, the phantasm is seen as a reliable presentation being given to the mind to work upon, assuming the actor is working with correct insight, smell, and so on. Now, it may take several repeated instances to grasp the universal, but eventually it would be obtainable to the individual. Kantians, on the other hand, coming from this post-Lockean world, as it were, are obsessed with the ideal real distinction as they define it. It's probably their greatest obsession. For them, it's how do I get out of my mind? How do I get to that object? It's like it's all they're concerned about. And it makes sense when you turn to what was happening in the scientific world at that time with the sort of mechanistic view of the cosmos, and you sort of reduce everything down to the efficient causes. You don't really have any kind of use for anything beyond what's going on up here. And so you can see why philosophy at that point, if that's where like the world as it is out there, kind of with the sciences sort of left theology and philosophy behind, well, then they felt there was nowhere else to go but inward. So how do I get out of the mind? How do I get out and know this object truly as it exists without my perceptions perceiving it? And do you see how these are two very different projects that we're talking about here, between what the Catholics are doing with the ideal and the real and what the idealists are doing with the ideal and the real? The Catholics are saying, I can perceive these things, and there's an end for which and I'm going to get to this, there's an end for which all of these things happen, and why I'm able to perceive these things. The idealists are kind of stuck in this world where it's like, how do I get out of this head and get to this thing as it truly is? Another difference you're going to have is the subject-object distinction. In the Catholic world, subject is the content of the thought, and the object is the precise perfection a thing is known by in the process of abstraction. Not a huge deal to understand that right now, but for the Kantians, it's very important to understand, because for them, the subject is anything that the mind is thinking of the thing. It's the intramental. The object is simply the thing that the mind is reflecting upon. So that pretty much makes, if you kind of do the math here, basically everything is subjective at that point, right? The objective world is we don't really have access to it anymore. Now, Kant's not going to go in his own language that far. He comes up with something like the categorical imperative for morals and these types of things. But we live 200 years from the time of Immanuel Kant, and we can go back and kind of reflect and critique some of these things, because I think we know what some of the outcomes of some of this type of thought is when you begin to purview the world as just this massive particular subjective experiences of consciousness. You end up with some of the crazy things that we have today. All of this is going to lead Kant to develop this concept of the critical. The fact that an aware mind is one that is conscious of the fact that the mind is basically boxed in, right? So it's this, like, I mean, and the whole idea of thinking about thinking, people have been talking about that since back in the time of the Greeks, but Kant really, really puts the gas on it. The fact that we're thinking about thinking, but also that we're like boxed in, and there's no way to get outside of that filter. And even in modernity, he doesn't invent this, right? This goes back to Descartes. This goes back to Berkeley. Kant, in his attempt to give him maybe some the good side of what he was trying to do, anyways. I feel like sometimes when I'm critiquing someone, I maybe come off as a little too harsh of the person, but I'm serious in my critiques of Kant. I think there's real problematic aspects of him, even if there's some other aspects that I think were good about Immanuel Kant. I do want to make sure, though, that I'm not trying to dismiss him. I think his arguments were cogent. I think they were valid, and I think they need a robust response. So it's really what I'm trying to do here. But he makes a mess of what we can do with philosophy if you're going to go that route. He's trying to get past David Hume's problem, and he made the problem. If it's like if our mind is a box and we're imprisoned inside of that box, instead of making something that we can peep through, he just made the box even thicker, even harder to penetrate. And that's what you can do in the box, right? Or, excuse me, there's what you can do in the box, and then there's what you can do outside of the box. And outside of the box, well, how do we even begin to bridge that? You can't. Not in Kant's view. Aristotle's view is that the mind perceives external objects through the senses. A phantasm is made. These phantasms are roughly correct representations of the object that's out there in the world. Despite the limits of the senses, these phantasms correspond to the real mind-independent objects as they would exist under normal conditions of both the senses and of the object. And Scotus he's going to agree with that by and large. Now, Scotus does acknowledge the limitations of the finite created mind. And maybe this is where we could find a little bit of common ground, because Kant is saying, look, he's just trying to have some epistemic humility. That's what he calls it. And Scotus says, yeah, look, the mind especially it's marred by the darkening effects of sin. It's also finite. It's created. There are limitations. But even as far as the darkening effects of sin goes, it's a dimmed light. It's not a light that's extinguished. Scotus also distinguishes between the intuitive cognition, the direct apprehension of the existing object as it is, and then that traditional Aristotelian abstractive cognition, which is the knowledge of the object's essence, even if it's not present. You've abstracted the idea of dogness. You can call upon that from memory. Well, Scotus is saying that there's an intuitive, I have run across dogs before in the past, and when I run across this dog in this moment, I don't even have to before, obviously memory, maybe if I've been bit by a dog in the past or something and I have a fear of dogs, obviously there's going to be something that happens in the process of memory that excites my the sensations of my mind. But Scotus is saying before that even happens, there's an intuitive recognition of the dog as a universal before the mind even acts upon it. And this is a very strong realism. And this is why many of the alchemists and the Protestants and the Enlightenment philosophers saw Scotus as one of the most dangerous to their systems. Going even further than that, his belief in the univocal concept of being further solidifies his realism. He's over here arguing that the concept of being applies in the same sense to both God and creatures. And so this allows the mind to form concepts that it can apply to reality, both the created and to the divine, even though it's never going to understand the infinite in its fullness by far. But it can apply these concepts because it's real, it's true, and it applies both to the created and to the divine without being purely confined to these sort of mental constructs. And this is going to ensure that my knowledge and your knowledge of reality and of the reality of God is grounded in something that is real It's not just a series of ideas or representations. It's not just the phenomena of the things that are out there. Like, we actually truly come to understand being as a universal concept. Meanwhile, Kant is arguing that we perceive only the phenomena, the things as they appear to us. And they're going to be filtered through these categories like space or time or causality. And so remember, there's a big leap with Kant, which is that it's you, the subject, it's the mind, imparting those categories onto the world out there and during the cognitive process. It's the a priori on the object. Space and time, for example, it's like they're front loaded. So your sense of vision and the spatial dimensions of an object are not the object emitting that data to you. It's you imposing those sensations, those things onto the object. And then the object presents them back to the mind through this entirely filtered process. The thing in itself, the object as it is, the noumena, that exists completely independent of anything that you can know. It's totally unknowable. We only know the world as structured by our mind's framework, not the raw object, not the raw data itself. Now, there is in all of this maybe a moment, a quick little moment where we could possibly begin to find a little bit of common ground, somewhat. Imagine Scotus. Anyone else notice that I put Scotus in the Jordan Peterson side? I was kind of like, well, I think Jordan Peterson would be like likes to talk a lot. I can imagine Scotus as a lecturer, like to talk a lot. Kant, I can imagine Kant was a very sort of temperamental man, apparently, from what I understand, but he was probably a good conversant as well. But anyways, trying to find a little bit of common ground between them and how they would argue these things. Maybe one thing that we could say is that Scotus does give us the haseity, the thisness, the individuating principle of a thing, which is, in many ways, it's beyond our abstractive limitations. It's beyond our intuitive limitations. Scotus doesn't deny that we can't know particulars, we can know individuals, we can, he would say, but to truly understand the thisness of an object, the haseity of an object, is for God and God alone. We can see it as an individual, we can even intuit it as an individual, but the actual, the underlying thisness, the thing that makes you, you, and me, is not something that we could put under a microscope and understand or recognize or come to know in that sort of real way that we come to know these other aspects of an object. So my question is, does this maybe sort of touch base with Kant's noumena a little bit? Maybe it does, but I would say even there, this is something of a moot point, since they're really not even worried about the same things. Because remember, Kant's like in a mental prison cell, and he wants to know, how do I get out of here? How do I get out of this prison cell? Oh, it looks like we can't get out of the prison cell. So here's what's in the prison cell, and then there's the world out there, whatever. Basically rendering the noumena useless to us. Blessed John Duns Scotus says, I don't think so. Pun intended. He says, no, we know the thing. I've grasped this particular cup right here, right? I come to know the nature of cupness over time. I may not know this particular cup's haxeatas, the individual thisness of this cup, but I can recognize it as a particular cup. I can extract from it a universal of cupness. And the reason for all of that, the reason that we're doing all of that, and this is my essential thesis to this entire presentation tonight. So if you've hung in with me this long. The reason that we do that for Scotus is very clear, because God wants us to know him. And the only way that we could know him naturally without revelation, without him being revealed to us, is if we know being. If we know being univocally. Now, being univocally at first, it's going to be confused, yes, undivided, but being is the first object of the intellect. Nobody, like, this is all the scholastics would agree on this, except for maybe some later thinkers. But it is known, it is pondered, it directs our mind towards knowing this particular being versus this particular being. So we start to, divide and compare and these types of things, contrasting, but all with the ultimate purpose to get us to reflect upon being as such. Because to reflect upon being as such, we will begin naturally in our minds to reflect on God eventually, in a natural, not a supernatural sense. This is why Father Fellner says that the mind for Scotus is up in the clouds. It's thinking about higher things. It's doing the work of the saints. It's, you're like, I liken it maybe to, think of yourself, you're on an island and you're given a hammer and you're given wood and you're maybe even given like set of plans to build a ship, right? Scotus is going to say, like, okay, if you're thinking about these things as a practical sense, like, I'm going to get to work on what these things are clearly here for. I may not like know it. I may not know the intent of it like right now, but clearly, like, I think the perfect exemplar of all of this is going to be Our Lady, right? She pondered these things in her heart. She was worried about it, but she gave her fiat. She gave her yes. And then look what happens, right? Humanity is redeemed. So Scotus is saying, look, the reason that we have these, God has given us these tools is ultimately for our benefit and for our sanctification and for our holiness. So if we're on this island, if we have the hammer, we have the materials, we have the set of plans, we get to building. That's what we do. Now the Kantian's going to be sitting there and he's going to be going, how do I justify these tools? Like, what are these tools? What is this hammer? What is this wood that we speak of? How do I know about these things? And he's sitting there, and that's what they're going to do with philosophy, right? Philosophy, they're going to worry about, how do I justify the tools that I've been given, instead of actually like making the tools and putting them to a practical use. And that's really what it all comes down to, in my opinion. That's why you're never going to get these two you're never going to join these two together. And if you ever see a Kantian Scotus, just know that you're dealing with someone who really doesn't know what they're talking about. You can't even, if you read Father Fellner's essay in this on Thomistic, Transcendental Thomism, you can't do it with Thomas either. As much as Marshall may have wanted to, it's not going to happen without seriously, and Father Fellner's thesis in that is that you don't do what Transcendental Thomism does and retain your Thomism. You lose it in the process. Or if you were to maybe go in the other direction, you would just lose Kantianism in the process, and then it's like, why even have it to begin with? So the Kantian revolution, the Kantian Copernican revolution, turns out really ultimately to be a prison cell. Whereas I think that the scholastic metaphysics are, they're pragmatic, and they're like a starting point for how we can really, I think, take on modernity without caving into modernity. That would take me really far afield, and I'm going to have to like save that for future lectures. But I think that kind of like drives home some of my points for tonight. I think if there's anything else I wanted to cover. I know I covered a lot with that, guys. And if you have to, just go back and like watch the lecture again, or just leave some comments and ask questions in the comments, because it's quite a bit to it all. But really, I want to see the Catholic Church actually like doing the kind of things that Cardinal Ratzinger was talking about and that Father Fellner were talking about, where we are robustly taking on modernity without the two kind of methods that we have unfortunately employed up till now, which has largely been one, we totally cave into modernity and we just accept it wholesale, or two, we do this kind of like, we're just going to like bum rush in with our Thomas manuals and just sort of really like ignore the fact that these questions are out there and they exist and they have permeated society very, very deeply. And I don't think that we can't cower from that if we actually want to like make a long, sustainable, lasting difference. So I think that's, personally, I go the route of Scotus. Personally, I go the route of Bonaventure and these thinkers and Maximilian Kolbe in particular, as a way to sort of, you look at it as like a police officer's tool belt. You're going to go out into the world. You don't just want one tool, you want several tools. And the scholastics are a fantastic tool, especially for getting first principles correct, especially for getting your metaphysics correct. I think all other things, this is one of the things that the Kantian revolution did, is that it really just kind of made metaphysics something that you can sort of take or leave. Whereas I think it's essential. And once you've set up that essential base, then you're able to kind of move on down the stream and start engaging Kantian thought, or probably even I'm using Kant tonight because he's someone that I thought was maybe a little bit more approachable for Catholics to engage. But I think even probably more than a challenge. Well, they're comparable, but in different ways. But you also got Hegel to contend with and Hegelian philosophy, which is spend any time in modern philosophy and tell me that hasn't permeated out into the world. So I see some people. Eric, my friend, I think you asked a question last time I was on, and yeah, I don't know if you saw the beginning, but I did. I answered it in the comment section because I just wasn't getting any comments last time. I don't know. I had to do some kind of reset. I banged my head against the wall discussing that point with Thomists. I think you threw that out there when I was talking about the subject of being, the univocal concept of being, and how it's not like, it doesn't drop God down into a genus. And yeah, I've had that. We just I don't know exactly where that error began in terms of like how that rumor got started. I have a suspicion, but I've never been able to like back it up where it comes from. But it's one that we're like slowly working on trying to correct and clarify. And maybe, the Dominicans and the Franciscans will come together and start singing Kumbaya song together. But yeah, I totally get what you're saying too. And I love my Thomas friends, but it's tough having this particular conversation with them due to some of the misinformation out there. All right, so that's all I see. Glad that you guys were able to tune in. That's about it for tonight, guys. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I know it was a little bit of a dense topic if you're not really a philosophy nerd. We had to put our nerd glasses on tonight, get into some study systematic and critical, and read our Immanuel Kant on a Monday night, and our critique of French transcendental Thomism. But we love it. It's what makes life worth living, is all of this fantastic things to learn. And I'm very grateful I get to share it with you guys. Wednesday night, I have the book club, which we're going to be going into. It's going to be more systematic in its approach. I'm going through the book. It's called Rebuild My Church by Father Andronco. It's going through the ecclesiology and the Mariology of Father Fellner. You don't have to even subscribe to my Patreon channel, though it'd be nice if you did. I'm just going to make it, I'm going to try to set it up where it's like just, all you got to do is join. It's just join the live and it'll be free. And then, yeah, we're going to be going a chapter a month over the next several months. I think that'll end us in May, if I'm not mistaken. So once a month, the book club over at City of the Immaculata, patreon.com/City of the Immaculata. Hope to see you guys there. God bless you all. I will see you next time.
Honey, their coffee can't hold a candle to yours.
Instant Folgers taste good as fresh perked.
This is Earth, the year 2100. This is the headquarters of Space Patrol. And men from Earth, Mars, and Venus live and work there as guardians of peace.
In the nation's capital, President Johnson today welcomed British Prime Minister Douglas Hume.